Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share Goatman encounters I found on the internet. I said in my last episode that these are hard to come by, but I did some digging and I was able to come up with these stories. They include several encounters in Texas, which seems to be a hotspot for this cryptid, and a young man with some strange experiences in a forest in England. But first, we start with a young woman who ventured out to Old Alton Bridge, otherwise known as Goatman's Bridge, in Texas with her sisters and got the experience of a lifetime. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. And on that note, I would like to give a shout out to the channel's first two members, Wisteria and Aussie Jubes. I hope I'm saying that right. Thank you for your generosity. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes from a poster who had a very strange experience with her sisters while visiting Texas. Her story takes place at the Old Alton Bridge, also known as Goatman's Bridge. The Old Alton Bridge is located in northeast Texas and connects the cities of Denton and Copper Canyon. It is known for its supernatural and paranormal activity. This, of course, includes encounters with Goatman. The original poster, or OP, lived in Nebraska at the time, but her sisters were visiting her father for the summer, who lived outside of Dallas, Texas. So she took some time off work and went down for a week. Being that she and her two younger sisters were very much fascinated by the paranormal and supernatural, they decided to go over to Goatman's Bridge to see if they could experience anything. And experience something they did. The OP says she had an encounter with a shadow person years before this, but what happened to her and her sisters while at Old Alton Bridge takes the cake. The only problem the OP had was her father not wanting them to go out to the bridge, being that he was very religious and against haunted places, demons, and trying to contact spirits. So she told him she and her sisters were heading out to eat after going to Six Flags for the day and took off for Denton, Texas, then Goatman's Bridge. When they arrived, they had a little trouble with her GPS, but eventually found the gravel road where the bridge was, turned down it, and parked. They came across a group of people who told them the Goatman hadn't been out that night, to be safe, and for the girls to check out the creepy path to the left. It was about 10:30 p.m. when they ducked under the metal fence and started their investigation. The OP says the forest had an eerie feel to it, and even though they heard the cicadas chirping, there was a heaviness in the scene that seemed to press down on them. They were also hit with the feeling that they were being watched as they ventured further into the woods. Their phone flashlights did little to illuminate their surroundings, which included heavy shrubbery that the OP could not help but feel as if something was lurking within. She dismissed the feeling as her psyching herself out. By the time they reached the bridge, the OP admits she was spooked due to the fact that it was so dark and they could hardly see the bridge. This was intensified with the feeling of being watched growing stronger. She once again chalked up how she was feeling to her own paranoia. She and her sisters talked about how creepy the bridge was as they continued across it while reading the writing and looking at the satanic symbols etched into it. Continuing forward, the OP scanned the end of the bridge with her light and thought she saw a black mass standing there. When she brought her light back to the spot, whatever had been there, if anything, was gone. The girls also heard movement behind and below them near the creek, but they saw no one else out there. This is when things took a weird turn. One of the OP's sisters was close to where she thought she saw the black mass and said she saw what looked like an eye peeking out from under the bridge. Her other sister began feeling physically ill and thought she heard a voice but could not make out what it was saying. The OP decided then that it was time to leave the bridge behind and check out the path the group told them about, but as they walked toward it, her and her sister's flashlights shut off. This freaked the girls out, but the OP was able to get hers back on while the sister tried to do the same. Just before they reached the path, that's when the OP saw it. Standing at the entrance of the trail where the trees began, approximately 20 or so feet from the OP and her sisters, was what she described as a tall, thin, black, shadowy mass. She says it looked as though the mass was a bit transparent but somehow solid too. She says it also looked as though it was flickering and wavering. She saw what looked to be long sharp claws and what looked to be an object in its other hand. However, she could not tell what this thing was holding. She could barely make out the eyes, but felt that they were fixed directly on her and her sisters. She ends her description of this being by saying that it felt evil. At first, the OP froze where she stood, sure that her eyes were merely playing tricks on her, so she took a step forward to see if she could get a better look at this thing. But when she did take that step, this thing moved and her uneasy feelings shifted into full-blown panic. She says she doesn't think she has ever screamed as loud as she did in that moment. She told her sisters to run, who thought she was kidding at first, but quickly realized she wasn't when the OP kept screaming. The three of them ran back to the car, and as they did, the OP looked over her shoulder to see this thing chasing them before it vanished into the night. She quickly returned her attention back to what was in front of her, slid under the metal fence, got in her car with her sisters, and gunned it, tearing out of there. She could hardly breathe while driving away and was shaking and crying. She also says her body felt like it was on fire. When they got back to the main road, they saw two men dressed in white running toward where they had just been. The OP believes that they probably heard her screaming. The girls rode back to their father's house, which was an hour trip, in silence. The OP kept going over what happened in her mind and tried to come up with a logical explanation for what she saw, but was unable to. Part of her wanted to go back and see if she could figure out what that thing was, but the other part wanted to stay as far away as possible. In any case, she was very freaked out and was genuinely concerned for her and her sister's safety in those woods. She ends her post by saying she thought everything she had heard about the Goatman's Bridge was just an urban legend and made up by locals. She didn't think there was anything out there to be afraid of, but found out that night she was wrong. She doesn't think she saw the Goatman that night, but definitely thinks there is something at Old Alton Bridge, and whatever it is true evil. It is often said if you go searching for things like this, it is likely you will find what you are looking for. And the OP and her sisters definitely found what they were in search of at Old Alton Bridge, if not more than what they bargained for. After having experienced what they did while on the bridge, I'm not sure what enticed them to want to also go down the path the group they saw when they arrived told them about. That would have been enough for me, especially after hearing the footsteps below and her sister seeing what looked like an eye peering up at her from under the bridge. But they continued searching and they continued to find. And what they got was a terrifying chase through the woods by some unknown entity. As to whether this was Goatman or not is up for debate, but given the location and the many appearances of Goatman not just there but seemingly all over Texas, it would probably be a lot of people's first guess. However, there is no smoking gun to say for sure that's what the girls saw out there that night. There is one more thing I wanted to mention about this story, and it involves the OP wanting to go back out there to further investigate. I would strongly recommend against this, as nothing good usually comes from it. More than like as not, she would just be inviting more activity and unwanted encounters into her life. Being that she is a paranormal and supernatural fanatic, she might welcome this, but it usually doesn't end well based on the stories I've heard. Then there is the hitchhiker effect, which is when these beings attach themselves to you and follow you home. Then they begin tormenting you where you live. I've mentioned this before, and the most famous case I can think of is Scott Carpenter, who went out to prove the existence of what he believed to be an undiscovered species of ape living in the woods but found Sasquatch instead, and they followed him home. This led to a lot of unwelcome activity at his house. He has a channel on YouTube documenting his many sightings of these beings. It's very interesting what he has found and caught on camera. But going back to the OP's encounter at Old Alton Bridge, what do you think she and her sisters encountered out there that night on the bridge, and what do you think they saw that chased them to their car? Goatman or something else? The next story is actually two different stories that also take place in Texas. Apparently, the state is a hotbed for Goatman activity, and not just at Old Alton Bridge. The first encounter was the original post, with the second one being left in the comment section. The first encounter took place back in either 2010 or 11 while the OP was up late at night and was bored and restless, as he puts it. At around 3 a.m. he decided to take the trash out and glanced up the street when he did. What he saw made him freeze where he stood and sent a surge of intense fear running through him. There was a creature standing in the street looking around as if it was confused, according to the OP. He says he could see the outline of horns and hooves with the help of the streetlights. He was unsure if this thing had seen him, so he took off running, heading back inside, his eyes beginning to water. Once inside, he ran upstairs to see if the creature was still in the street, but it was gone. He told his sister what he saw, but she didn't believe him. 2 years later, there was a show on TV the OP says was called Monsters and Myths in America. On the show, they talked about and showed an image of the Texas Goatman. The OP called his sister and told her to turn on the program. They both screamed, and she asked, "Isn't that what you described to me?" He told her it was, and it was exactly what he saw standing in the street that night. His sister freaked out, happy that he wasn't crazy. He ends his post by saying other people in Texas had seen the Goatman too. The second story was one posted in the comments replying to the original poster's story. The user who left his tale in the comment section says he grew up just east of Houston, near where the San Jacinto River meets the Ship Channel and bays that run into the Gulf of Mexico. He heard about Goatman sightings throughout his childhood, saying how the creature was rumored to live off a dirt road outside of town. The road had a forest on one side and the bay on the other. He went down the road many times at night while growing up, usually either on a dare to smoke a certain substance or to take a date to be alone when he got a little bit older. He says he never came face to face with the Goatman, but he always had the feeling he was being watched while on that road. Strange things happened there, and it was always pitch black and dead silent. He never heard any wildlife while down the road and sometimes heard footsteps within the trees. The last thing I want to mention about Goatman sightings in Texas is another comment detailing how the user who left it always heard Goatman stories growing up too. They specifically remember one encounter they heard about near the Sabine River, close to Kilgore and Longview. Bodies were pulled out of the river on occasion. Just like with Michigan and Dogman, it would seem Texas is ground zero for Goatman sightings. While searching for stories for this episode, I saw a lot of mention about Goatman encounters in the state. These two stories, along with the comment and the first story of this episode, all point to this. In the first story, the OP says he heard a lot of people from Texas say they have seen the Goatman, and the user sharing the second story as well as the commenter both say they grew up hearing about Goatman in Texas. Now I know Goatman has been seen in other states, but it really makes me wonder why there are so many more sightings in Texas than anywhere else. What do you think about these two stories, and why do you think there are so many Goatman sightings in Texas? The final story of this episode comes from England, where the original poster had some really weird experiences in a forest he frequents. He does not say where exactly his story takes place, just that he lives in southeast England. The forest in question is near the OP's house and one he visits a lot, as he and his friends go mountain biking there. The OP and his friends have only ever seen one other person in the forest while biking, an older man walking his dog, which is a German Shepherd. The OP says every time he sees the man, he is overcome with a sense of unease due to the energy given off by the stranger. He and his friends never see him coming, and it's like he appears out of nowhere to walk past them. There is a tree there that was turned into a memorial for a dog that died. The dog was a German Shepherd, which, according to the OP, is the same dog walked by the older man they see and looks very similar. On top of this, the OP sometimes hears a dog collar behind him when he is deep within the forest. This is just the beginning of how strange things can be in that forest. The OP tells about a spot he and his friends go to a lot to camp and hang out. They were out there late one night at around 9 or 10 p.m. and eventually started feeling creeped out. He says the energy began to change and the feeling only intensified the longer they remained out there. Then they started hearing a very strange noise that the OP knows without a doubt was not a fox or a bird. He says it started out sweet and innocent at first before turning into a blood-curdling shriek. By this point, he and his friends were ready to just get out of there, so they packed up their belongings and did just that. The path out of the forest would lead them through a field. Once the group was in the field, they were hit with an overwhelming feeling the OP says felt like a mixture of dread, sadness, and something akin to anger. It was then that they began hearing very heavy footsteps running in the foliage. This was accompanied by growling and screaming, which continued to grow worse until they made it across the field. When they left the field, all noise ceased. The OP says he and his friends all had weird dreams that night. There was another night the OP heard heavy footfalls while in the forest. His friend had gone to relieve himself and the footsteps started running right behind the OP. He thought it was his friend until the friend returned and asked him if he heard the running too. 2 days before he posted his story online, the OP returned to the forest for the first time in 5 months. The strange feeling he felt that night with his friends came over him once again, and in some areas it grew stronger, but he did not allow it to bother him. He again returned the day he posted his story after a heavy rain which left the ground muddy. While there, he kept hearing the dog collar that follows him and saw strange hoof prints in the mud. He says there would be a group of them out of nowhere, then no more until about 15 to 20 meters ahead on the path. He did not see any footprints when he was there 2 days prior and says it takes so long to get to the part of the woods he was in at the time that many people wouldn't even bother going out there, and that it is impossible to get a horse into the area he was in. He ends his post with a few theories as to what he thinks might be going on in those woods. His first thought was that there might be a Goatman in the forest. He says Goatman is linked with canine deaths, and along with the signs of cryptid activity there, as well as hoof prints, could point to the presence of Goatman. His next theory is that the hoof marks belong to the devil himself, but says he doesn't think this is very likely or plausible. However, the presence he feels in those woods definitely feels demonic to him. His third theory suggests that the woods might be haunted, as it could be a dumping ground for bodies. There was a suspected murder in a local town and the police searched the woods. This would explain the presence there, he says, but not the cryptid activity. His last theory is that so many people ride their dirt bikes in the forest that someone could have died out there and now haunts it. I can see how and why the OP believes the forest might be haunted, but with everything described, I believe there is some type of cryptid out there. There is the feelings of being creeped out, dread, unease, sadness, and even what he says felt close to anger. Then there are heavy footsteps running in the forest, the growling and the screaming. As for what kind of cryptid, the hoof prints definitely point to it being a Goatman. They are said to have hooves instead of feet. One thing I find eerie and strange about this story is the OP saying he hears the distinct sound of a dog collar while in some parts of the forest. That and the presence there feels demonic in nature. Now, whatever being there feeling evil to him could also point to it being a cryptid, as this is a normal thing that comes up in a lot of these stories. But perhaps there is more going on in that forest than just cryptid activity. This does happen, as an area could be a hotspot not just for cryptid activity but also for the paranormal. In any case, there is definitely something going on in those woods. Whether it's a Goatman, a haunting, something demonic, or all of the above is anyone's guess. What do you think is going on in that forest? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.